The opening chapter of any novel is really important. You want to hook the reader's interest and get them invested in your story. This is a little different when it comes to sequels because chances are your reader is already invested in your character and your overarching story, or they wouldn't have bothered to read the book at all. But you still want to make a good impression in your first chapter. Given there are 7 Harry Potter novels, there are of course 7 opening chapters. In this video I'm going to rank all of them from worst to best, purely based on my own opinion and how much I enjoy each chapter. So at number 7 I have Dudley Demented from the Order of the Phoenix. Whilst I don't dislike this chapter, it's always felt a bit off for me. It starts with Harry laying in one of the Dursleys' flower beds and listening to the television through the open window. He then hears the sound of someone disapparating and goes to investigate. He bumps into Dudley whilst walking around Little Whinging, and the pair of them are then set upon by 2 Dementors. I think my problem is that action sequences don't sit comfortably in an opening chapter. Now that's quite a subjective opinion, and feel free to disagree, but all the best action scenes in Harry Potter are really built up. The Triwizard Tournament tasks are a great example. There's a lot of tension released during those chapters because they're built up so well, whereas the Dementor attack in this chapter almost comes out of nowhere. And given the generally slower pace of the rest of the novel, this quick start feels out of place. And in at number 6 I have The Worst Birthday from the Chamber of Secrets. I actually really like this chapter, it's just not as good as the other 5 I'm going to talk about. And the main reason I like it so much is because it's funny. Again, the whole chapter takes place at the Dursleys, and it starts with Harry and the others at the breakfast table. I love how Dudley's first line is "I want more bacon." I always think that's really funny. And then Uncle Vernon's reaction to Harry mentioning magic is just ridiculous. A good portion of the chapter is dedicated to recounting the events of the first book, which I totally understand. You need to do this when you're writing sequels. It's just when you've read the series a lot of times, it's kind of redundant. But there's also more humour when the Dursleys prepare for the arrival of the Masons and Dudley acts like a complete moron. It's not an amazing chapter by any means, but it's funny despite the fact that Harry's pretty miserable for a lot of it. At number 5 I have Owl Post from The Prisoner of Azkaban. This follows a similar pattern in the sense that there's a fair degree of going over previous events again, and there's also a fair bit of humour as well. Ron's conversation with Uncle Vernon is laugh out loud funny, particularly if you listen to the audiobook by Stephen Fry. However, what tips this chapter slightly ahead of the opening of the Chamber of Secrets is when Harry reads the letters from Ron, Hermione and Hagrid, and he also opens the gifts they give him for his birthday. It's really nice for him to finally get some genuine birthday presents because he more than deserves it. On to number 4, I have The Dark Lord Ascending from the Deathly Hallows. Harry isn't featured in this chapter at all. Instead, we follow Snape as he arrives at Malfoy Manor and sits amongst Voldemort and the other Death Eaters. This chapter works well for 2 reasons. Firstly, it sets the darker tone for the rest of the Deathly Hallows, and secondly, it's really interesting to see a large meeting from the opposing side. And linked with this idea, we get to see Snape acting out his role as a double agent. Now this isn't the first time this happens, we also see this in the 2nd chapter of The Half-Blood Prince as well, but it is the first time we see Snape amongst a large crowd of Death Eaters. And of course, the information they discuss also links with the 7 Potters, which is the 4th chapter of the Deathly Hallows. At number 3, I have The Boy Who Lived from the Philosopher's Stone. This is the chapter where it all began, and it's fascinating from a writer's perspective. If you do creative writing as a hobby, or even more seriously, it's a fun chapter to analyse and understand what Rowling is doing to try and hook in the reader. And she does a great job. The chapter opens by discussing the Dursleys, what they do, what they look like, but what hooks you in are 2 very specific lines. The Dursleys had everything they wanted, but they also had a secret, and their greatest fear was that somebody would discover it. They didn't think they could bear it if anyone found out about the Potters. From here, the story follows Mr. Dursley as he overhears people in cloaks discussing the name Harry Potter, and how he then voices his concerns with his wife. It's the ending of the chapter that's the most famous though, probably because this is where the movie starts. Dumbledore, McGonagall and Hagrid come to Privet Drive and leave Harry on the doorstep of number 4. It's a fun close to the chapter and it's a great foundation for the rest of the series. And the runner-up is The Other Minister from The Half-Blood Prince. Now my prediction is that some people won't be too pleased about this because I think some find this chapter quite mundane, which I get that, there's no action, but I personally really like it. It's fascinating to get a look at the relationship between the Muggle Prime Minister and Cornelius Fudge. Whilst the chapter simultaneously recounts the major wizarding events of the last few books, it's a very clever idea. The dialogue is particularly good in this scene. You really get an understanding of how the two men see each other and their attitudes towards one another. And to top it off, we're also introduced to a new character, Rufus Scrimgeour, which makes for a nice ending to the chapter. Which leaves number 1, the Riddle House from the Goblet of Fire. If you've been watching this channel for a while, you'll know the Goblet of Fire is my favourite book in the series, and unsurprisingly, I love the first chapter. It can be a bit disconcerting the first time you read it because it's the first chapter in the whole series that doesn't follow Harry. So it kind of takes you off guard the first time you read it, but when you revisit the series, you appreciate it a lot more. The first part of the chapter is set a long time before the main events of the series, back when Tom Riddle was just a teenager, and it details the villagers' reaction to the deaths of Tom Riddle Sr. and his mother and father. The second half takes place in the present and follows Frank Bryce, the gardener who works at the Riddle House. Frank notices a light in the old home and then goes to investigate. The conversation he overhears between Voldemort and Wormtail teases the reader about what's to come. And the bit that really hooks the reader more than anything else is when Voldemort talks about his faithful servant at Hogwarts. That's the really gripping part and essentially the start of the main plot line of the book. Thank you so much for watching. How would you rank the opening chapters of the Harry Potter books? Leave your thoughts below in the comments. Other than that, it's goodbye from me until next time.